The picturesque town of Libby, Montana lies at the heart of the Kootenai River Valley, surrounded by the majestic Cabinet Mountains with cascading waterfalls and verdant forests. But this seemingly delightful town bears a deep and painful wound. Between 1919 and 1990, thousands of Libby residents were exposed to a deadly form of asbestos. As of April 2024, this small town has suffered 2,400 cases of asbestos-related diseases and a further 700 excess deaths. Described as one of the worst man-made environmental disasters in US history, let's explore the greed, the negligence, and the dishonesty that led to the ruin of this small town community. The ancestral lands of the Kootenai people and other indigenous tribes have long been intertwined with what we now know as Libby. The first non-native presence arrived in the form of British fur traders in 1809, followed by prospectors in search of gold and silver in the 1860s. In 1889, a particularly rich deposit of silver and lead was discovered in the area, which sparked the rapid growth of both the town and the industry on which it would come to rely. While in search of further mining opportunities, prospectors in Libby came across a large deposit of vermiculite. This is a mineral that expands when heated, forming what are described as worm-like strands, with the name vermiculite coming from the Latin vermiculare, meaning to breed worms. These intricate worm-like structures give vermiculite a number of useful properties. In its expanded form, it's lightweight, fire-resistant, and chemically inert. It can act as an effective thermal conductor, and it has a large surface area, meaning it's highly absorbent. Today, it's used worldwide as insulation, soundproofing, and as filler in a range of products such as plastic, paint, and ink. It's also a popular soil additive, providing plenty of benefits to houseplants and back gardens everywhere. Although vermiculite had been known about for some time, it was Libby that catapulted the mineral into mainstream use. In 1919, American prospector and businessman Edgar N. Alley founded the Zonolite Company, which mined, processed, and sold vermiculite from Libby under the brand name Zonolite. The business was so successful that in 1963, it was acquired by chemical magnate W.R. Grace & Company, which expanded operations even further, producing up to 200,000 tons of vermiculite per year. The mineral was extracted from a vast open pit in Libby, known as the Zonolite Mine, transported to nearby facilities and mills, and then heated in a process referred to as exfoliation. This causes the water within the mineral to vaporize and the characteristic worm-like accordion structure to form. From there, it was shipped to other facilities across the United States, where it would be added to various products that were then to be sold globally. The sheer volume of vermiculite extracted and processed in and around Libby required a substantial workforce. Thousands of jobs were created, giving the town a significant financial boost, and mining quickly became synonymous with Libby life and culture. But there was a problem. Much of the vermiculite mined at Libby was contaminated with toxic asbestos. The kind of asbestos found in Libby was amphibole asbestos, which is defined by its tiny, brittle, needle-like fibers. These are microscopic, but long-term exposure and inhalation of these particles can cause severe and life-threatening damage to the lungs. Out of a population of just under 3,000, 2,400 have been diagnosed with asbestos-related diseases. While many of these cases are linked to miners and those working in the mills and processing plants, approximately half of those affected had no direct contact with these areas. The operations in Libby churned out an estimated 7 to 9 tons of dust daily, which was composed of between 40 and 80% asbestos. This hazardous dust, once released from the mines and mills, was carried by the wind and dispersed throughout the town. Additionally, workers returning home would carry it on their skin, their hair, and their clothes, contaminating their houses and, by extension, their families. As a result, the rate of lung disease in Libby is between 40 and 60 times higher than the US national average. A significant portion of the population suffers from asbestosis, a condition characterized by inflammation and scarring of the lungs, which makes it progressively harder to breathe. An asbestosis diagnosis also comes with a heightened risk of developing mesothelioma, which is a rare form of cancer that originates in the lining of certain organs. Frequently emerging in the lungs or abdomen due to direct exposure to asbestos, mesothelioma is known for its aggressive nature and rapid spread, typically leading to a life expectancy of only 1 to 4 years following diagnosis. Unfortunately, asbestos-related diseases can have a latency period anywhere from 10 to 40 years. Usually, symptoms only present 20 to 30 years after exposure, by which point the diseases have already begun to progress. Obviously, had the people of Libby been aware of the risk posed by the vermiculite operation in the town, they could have done something about it. But they didn't know. And neither should they have been expected to. They were not scientists, and the risks of asbestos were not publicly known in the way that they are today. In the words of one Libby resident in reference to the toxic dust, the workers couldn't smell it, they couldn't taste it. It didn't burn. There was no indication it was anything more than plain old dust. Children played in piles of it. Miners wore it as a badge of honor, and residents passed through it daily, none of them knowing that they were essentially breathing in poison. But someone else did. Many people did, in fact. Let's go back to 1963, when chemical giant W.R. Grace & Company first acquired the zonolite mine. In the thousands of lawsuits filed against W.R. Grace in the years following the mine's closure, it was pointed out that articles published in industry journals dating as far back as the 1930s had explicitly warned against the dangers of asbestos exposure. But the evidence of these risks extends even further. Prominent ancient Romans, Strabo and Pliny, noted an illness that affected those who worked with asbestos. They even cautioned against purchasing asbestos quarry slaves, as they often died young. Having said this, prior to the internet and this very scandal, the dangers of asbestos were not common knowledge amongst most people. However, it's been argued that W.R. Grace, a company that employed thousands of trained scientists, lawyers and engineers, must have been aware of the risks. In addition to this, between 1956 and 1964, the State Board of Health alerted both the original owners of the operation and W.R. Grace to the presence of hazardous levels of airborne asbestos in the vermiculite extraction mine and the processing mill. They also suggested dust control measures, including the utilization of masks in specific zones. Nevertheless, W.R. Grace chose to keep those reports confidential, and numerous workers allege that these safety recommendations never reached them. In 1959, X-rays were taken from 130 Libby miners, 48 of whom displayed evidence of asbestos-related lung disease. That's nearly 40%. Further tests would not be run until 1964 under W.R. Grace's management. However, this time, instead of taking X-rays from just miners, they included an additional 21 results from supervisory personnel who were less likely to have been exposed to higher levels of asbestos. This reduced the percentage of perceived lung abnormalities from 40% to 21%. A gross misrepresentation of the actual figures. Now enter longtime Libby localite Dr. Woodrow Nelson. As one of the town's few physicians, Nelson had evidence to suggest that W.R. Grace's test results were inaccurate. Consequently, he performed his own additional tests on the miners, which confirmed his suspicions. This he did voluntarily and without compensation, driven solely by concern for the well-being of his community. In 1964, Nelson penned several letters to executives of the zonolite division of W.R. Grace presenting his results. His findings revealed that miners in Libby faced a significantly higher risk of chronic lung disease than indicated by the company's tests. Moreover, he emphatically urged the company to fund additional studies on affected patients to gather a deeper understanding of their conditions and to prevent any further harm. In the response he received, Nelson was told that the issue was being addressed. However, when news of his letters reached the top executives of W.R. Grace, their primary concern was not the evident health risks he had presented, but the potential for public scrutiny. Executives immediately instructed the heads of the zonolite division to devise a plan to mitigate any unwanted attention. They also requested that Dr. Nelson's test results be disregarded and excluded from any official reports. Meanwhile, W.R. Grace's insurance carrier, Maryland Casualty, obtained both Nelson's reports and the original tests, forwarding them to a lung specialist for further evaluation. The specialist concurred that additional tests were necessary, recommending comprehensive epidemiological and physiological studies on all Libby workers. However, W.R. Grace only agreed to fund the studies if Maryland Casualty, their insurer, covered the costs. Sadly, they declined, and so these potentially life-saving studies were never conducted. 3 years later, in 1967, the first of numerous workers filed a claim against W.R. Grace, presenting conclusive signs of asbestosis. However, still apprehensive of the attention that a court case might provide, the company opted to settle out of court for an undisclosed sum. They did not admit any fault or responsibility. And this pattern persisted over time, coinciding with increasingly stringent government regulations on asbestos, thereby heightening W.R. Grace's vulnerability to liability. The company responded to these concerns by funding an animal study on the effects of tremolite, the specific type of amphibole asbestos found in Libby vermiculite. Their aim was to demonstrate that tremolite was non-carcinogenic, thereby seeking to exclude it from the definition of asbestos. However, their hopes were dashed when then the study revealed the opposite outcome. By 1983, new legislation mandated W.R. Grace to report all data on the environmental and health effects of tremolite to the Environmental Protection Agency. Despite this obligation, a report submitted in 1983 failed to mention the animal studies and concluded with a statement asserting, "We wish to emphasize that we have no reason to believe there is any risk associated with the current uses of Libby vermiculite-containing products." Prior to this, in 1980, the Mine Safety and Health Administration notified W.R. Grace of their intention to conduct a morality study on the health risks associated with handling vermiculite in Libby. However, evidence now suggests that the company went to great lengths to impede and prolong this investigation. In a memo penned by the director of the Zonalite division, Zonalite employees were advised to be slow, review things extensively, and contribute to delay, and attempt to apply influence via congressmen, senators, lobbyists, or others to get it turned off. It being the investigation. In a final attempt to absolve themselves of liability, in 1983, W.R. Grace once again pleaded ignorance, stating, "At this time, we do not have sufficient medical information or sufficient occupation and personal history data in these cases to make a judgment as to the cause of these illnesses." However, with multiple studies and mounting evidence of asbestos-related diseases as well as inexplicable mortality rates, it's evident that this claim was categorically false. An assessment the residents of Libby strongly agreed with as more and more lawsuits began to emerge. In the mid-1980s, the Public Citizen magazine and several Montana newspapers initiated coverage on the asbestos-related illnesses plaguing Libby, along with the ensuing legal battles. Despite this, the story went largely unnoticed by the national press. Having said this, with a plethora of undeniable evidence now available that conclusively proved the danger of asbestos, in 1989 the EPA banned its use nationwide, though exceptions and loopholes do still exist. Subsequently, in 1990, W.R. Grace finally halted operations at Libby. However, this by no means marks the end of their story, just another chapter. Montana's workers' compensation and occupational disease laws posed significant obstacles for Libby workers seeking to sue W.R. Grace. Claims had to be filed within 3 years of the claimant's last day of work, a requirement that proved both unreasonable and impossible for many, given the decades-long latency periods associated with asbestos-related diseases. However, in 1995, Libby workers were declared exempt from the rule, enabling them to pursue legal action against W.R. Grace if they could demonstrate intentional harm done by the company. This opened the floodgates to thousands of new lawsuits. By 1999, W.R. Grace had paid out an estimated $400 million in 154,000 claims against them. Unable to ignore the scale of the issue, the Libby asbestos disaster finally made national headlines that same year, garnering at least some of the attention that it so desperately deserved. However, in an effort to avoid further litigation, in 2001, W.R. Grace declared bankruptcy. At this point, they were still facing 129,000 asbestos-related lawsuits, but filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy meant that these lawsuits had to be frozen until the company had been restructured. Then, to mitigate the number of post-bankruptcy lawsuits, the company allocated $1.8 billion to 2 trust funds that would be used to compensate claimants. Despite these efforts, in 2005, the Department of Justice initiated criminal proceedings against the company, alleging that several executives were aware of the risks of asbestos exposure, yet deliberately continued to endanger people. But in 2009, in a remarkable turn of events, a federal jury acquitted the company of all charges. While this verdict came as a disappointment to many, especially the long-suffering residents of Libby, it did not absolve the company of its responsibilities. Recognizing the undeniable need for restitution, the US government mandated W.R. Grace to pay $250 million towards the EPA's cleanup endeavors in Libby. The quest to eradicate asbestos from the town has been relentless and ongoing. In 2000, the EPA initiated an investigation to devise a comprehensive decontamination strategy for the area. These plans were enacted swiftly and persist to this day, and efforts have yielded tangible results, as evidenced by a staggering 100,000-fold reduction in asbestos levels in the town's air compared to when the mine was operational. Extensive screening encompassed approximately 8,000 properties in the area, revealing that 2,600 of these necessitated some form of cleanup. Moreover, the scandal served as a catalyst for raising critical awareness about the hazards of asbestos and the dire consequences of prioritizing profit over public safety. But for the residents of Libby, who have already lost their lives or their loved ones, these developments offer little solace. The ramifications of this deadly scandal have been devastating, resulting in the obliteration of entire families. Individuals completely unrelated to the mine's operations continue to receive diagnoses of asbestos-related lung diseases with alarming frequency, a trend that local doctors predict will persist until at least 2030. The contamination crisis of Libby stands as one of the most egregious public health disasters in US history. Injustice permeated every facet of this ordeal, from the initial concealment of health risks to the belated acknowledgement of the profound harm inflicted upon the community. What was once the lifeblood of the town now casts a dark shadow over it. Yet this devastation wasn't inevitable. Environmental negligence, corporate malpractice, and a blatant disregard for public safety are to blame. As one Libby resident put it, W.R. Grace knew all the time, they just called it the dust. Mass murder is what you would call it. Despite the thousands of preventable illnesses and hundreds of premature deaths, Libby remains resilient and optimistic. Significant strides have been made in removing asbestos from much of the town, and its breathtaking landscapes continue to draw in tourists and outdoor enthusiasts every year. This small but tenacious community, long ignored and forsaken by those responsible for their well-being, remains steadfastly united in their pursuit of justice and their journey toward healing.